Okay, here it is early fall, October, and it seems that every autumn I get in the mood to look at American Revolution games because I'm particularly interested in the Battle of Saratoga, and Saratoga was fought around this time, September 19th and October 7th. But the game we're going to take a look at is SPI's The American Revolution. Now this is quite an old game. It was designed in 1972 by Jim Dunnigan, and is certainly out of print now and kind of rare. We're just going to take a look at the components, and I'll tell you a little bit about the game. Now, the game was quite radical even for its time in 1972, because in 1972 most games by SPI were designed with a standard hex grid, and this had quite a radically different kind of grid. I mean, area movement grids had been used before, but they were still kind of rare. And this one I thought was particularly good because the design behind it wasn't that they were just going to do like the colony of Georgia and the colony of South Carolina, North Carolina, etc. What they did was design the areas along the watershed basins of North America, because that's the way armies moved in those days. The watershed basins just were how armies moved. So the grid was quite different than anything we'd seen before. The rules were the standard kind of style at the time of SPI, usually a folder kind of thing. You see the rules weren't really complicated. They don't design games like that anymore, folders like that. They're usually booklets. So you can see what we're equivalent of 1, 2, 3, 4, sort of 8 pages of rules. So it was not a complicated game, but it was a very good one. And I'll set it up, and we'll take a look at the pieces. Now the copy you're seeing here is not my original copy from 1972. Because in 1972 we played it so much we actually wore the counters right out. We just played this thing to death. And I eventually got another copy on eBay. So I'll do the setup here, and we'll take a closer look at American Revolution. Okay, that's the general setup for the spring of 1775. Now each turn in the game represents several months. So 1775 you've got spring, summer, fall, then there's a winter turn. 1776, spring, summer, fall, winter turn, and so on, right to 1783. So it's a broad brush painting of the American Revolution, and each strength point is, I'd say, probably about 5,000 men or so. So these strength points are generic strength points. They can be just used like change. And I'll zoom in a moment so we can see the map closer. So the setup, we have just a very small force here at Quebec. That's Governor Carleton, fortified at Quebec. We have Gage's small force here of British regulars fortified in Boston, with the British fleet off the coast, and a small garrison of British regulars in Nova Scotia. And over here in the Massachusetts Bay Colonies, we have 27 factors of colonial militia. So this game starts technically after Lexington and Concord, and I guess prior to Bunker Hill, because we start here in spring. So Lexington and Concord has just happened, and Gage's forces are besieged in Boston. Now we'll zoom in a little bit to give you an idea of what the numbers mean on the map. Okay, here's a little closer view of the setup, and we'll take a look at what some of the numbers mean on the board. Now each of the areas has a little circle here with these various values on them. The upper left is the number of victory points if the side controls the area. Over here where it says C6, that's the maximum number of continental troops that can be raised when the American player raises them. And lower left, this quite high value, M27, represents the number of militia that is raised whenever the British first enter the colony. And as you can see here, that there are 27 militia besieging poor little Gage's force here of 3 regulars inside the fort, although they are tripled times 3. And the bottom right is the number of Tories that can be raised. Of course, in Massachusetts Bay colonies, you're not going to get too many Tories raised, as it was kind of the hotbed of the rebellion. And over here is the British fleet, which will aid the British in evacuating Gage's force or moving other forces in. So that's what the numbers mean. Now, the areas are subdivided too into sub-areas. For example, you have Lower England, New England here, with 2 areas. Movement is area to area. And you've got wilderness areas here, Green Mountains, Upper Massachusetts, Lake Champlain. It takes an entire turn to move into a wilderness area. 5 movement points. You actually have 5 movement points total, and it costs 1 movement point to go into an area, 5 into a wilderness. So to move into a wilderness, you're virtually going to have to be adjacent to it. Now, one thing about this game, I was playing this game a lot in '72, and later on in 1976, when Avalon Hill came out with their game, 1776, I was playing a lot of that game too. But this game is radically different than 1776 in one particular. In fact, it's radically different than a lot of games I've seen on the American Revolution. It takes a different view about the Tories in the Revolution. It's got the most liberal rating of Tories that I've ever seen, and that's refreshing. For example, in New York was a hotbed of Tory resistance, especially New York City. And in this game, you can see the militia value is 5, and the Tory value is 5. They're equal. You just don't see that in other games. In most games, it's it's gung-ho militia against the British, and Tory support is very small. But that wasn't the case historically. In some areas, there were real hotbeds of Tory resistance. And if you look at each of the colonies, you can see the various values. For example, Georgia here can raise 8 militia, but only 4 Tories. South Carolina, 5 militia, only 3 Tories. It's only in these 2 colonies here of New York and New Jersey are the Tory support equal to the militia. So that was a radical change from other games I'd seen on the Revolution. Now, I'm not going to go through a game, but I'm just going to go through some how the movement works and the combat and what happens in a typical turn. Okay, one interesting thing about the game and the way the militia worked was, again, quite different than a lot of the other games I'd seen. When the British regulars are in the same area as militia, and if the British leave the area, let's say for the sake of argument, we have General Gage here evacuate Boston by sea, hopping on the fleet and moving back to, let's say, Nova Scotia. When that happens, every single militia unit, militia mind you, goes off the board, goes home. So that would leave Massachusetts Bay with nobody there. So the militia could always come back at full strength. So if Gage returned, let's say he landed again, I don't know why he would, but let's say he landed back here in Boston with his 3 regulars, these 27 militia would reappear. So the militia was always available to Americans when the British enter their area. Now, this TD marker means Tory depletion. So when Gage got his, let's say, his 3 Tories there, because he was in the area, he gets 3 Tories, and if he decides to leave the Boston area, he converts these 3 Tories to British regulars, takes the Tories off, and then can evacuate the area. So Tories become part of the permanent British Army when they leave an area. That's why you leave this TD marker in. So for example, let's say we had a case where a British force landed in New York. There's nobody there currently. So he lands in New York, and it says the militia get 5. So we put on 5 militia. The American player would have the choice of which area in New York he wanted to come in. Usually he would pick the upper state New York here because he doesn't want to get trounced by the British force. The British player would then place his 5 Tories like that, and then we would put a TD marker, Tory depletion, to show that the Tories have been chosen. So that's generally how the militia and Tory system worked. Now, if this British Army wanted to leave New York, move into New Jersey, remember, if he wants to take those 5 Tories with him, they convert to British regulars, Tories come off, and the 5 regulars go with the British. So that's generally how the Tory militia system worked. Now, to show the uncertainty of movement in the Revolution, they used a simple but rather effective movement mechanism. The good old die roll. Whenever the British had to move a force, they had to roll a die. Okay, let's say for the sake of argument here, we have a little wee simulation of, let's say, the Saratoga campaign. We have a force here from Canada at Quebec. We have a small force here, a British in the Mohawk Valley, and a force of 10 coming up the Hudson Highlands. And we have an American force of 7 Continentals in the Lake Champlain area. As you can see, there's no militia or Tories raised in this area. Let's say it's the British turn, and the British intends to move all 3 forces onto Lake Champlain, kind of simulating what they wanted to do in the Saratoga campaign. Each force would have to roll a die, and if they roll a 1 or 2, the movement doesn't go through. So we'll try the force from Canada. They roll a die. Rolls a 1 or 2, the force from Canada does not move. Okay, the force from the Hudson Highlands rolls a die. Rolls a 6, they do move. And they move into Lake Champlain. And a little force here of Barry St. Leger, 3 factors, rolls a die. Rolls a 6, they do move. And there we have our first combat. In this case, 13 British regulars to 7 Continentals. And it's the old kind of classic combat results table, very simple. You compare odds and roll a die. The one thing that was odd about this game was that there was no 1 to 2 attack. You had to have minimum odds of 1 to 1 to do an attack. I think if I was designing the game today, I would at least have a 1 to 2 attack possible. Not too much a chance of winning, but I think I would have it in there, because there was several battles of the Revolution where the British attacked at lower than 1 to 1 odds and actually prevailed. So in this case, we'll roll the die. It's a 1 to 1. Roll the die, and it's 4, which is half exchange, which means the defender has to remove half of his points, and the attacker has to lose at least equal. So I think they round up. I don't remember. I'll say for the sake of argument they round up. So the American loses 4. So they have 3 Continentals left, and the British will also have to lose 4. 13. Okay, so that's how that would generally work. That's the half exchange result. So that's kind of how combat works. Now, to win the game, the British have to control, depending on the year, 51 or 61 points of colonies. So as the war progresses, that changes. It gets harder and harder to win the war. Something I kind of liked in this game. Again, a lot of other games didn't have that. It would have been easier to win the war in 1775 or 1776 rather than 1780. It just gets tougher and tougher and tougher to win the war as the war continues. Now, what about the French? Well, the French are kind of interesting. Again, the SPI took a different view than Avalon Hill did in 1776. In 1776, the Avalon Hill game, it was inevitable the French were coming. They were eventually going to join the colonists. The question was when. But in this game, they take a little bit different view. You have to earn a large victory to trigger the French coming in. And in this case, it's 5 strength points. So if the Americans can destroy 5 strength points of British regulars in a battle, equivalent kind of to the Saratoga event, then these seasonal French reinforcements will come in. And later on, permanent French forces will come in. And what is of great help also is the French fleet, which can now begin to interdict the British fleet and cause grief to the British player. So once the French come in this game, whoa, it's pretty well over. I don't see a British victory much after the French come in, which is probably pretty accurate. I can say one thing about the time scale of the game. When we played it, we often went to the last turn, and often the last die roll of the last turn. So it's a very, very equal game, balanced game. Hard to say. I mean, I think it's American bias, but it's just a very fun game to play. Now, I didn't mention how you raise continentals. That's by die roll. At an appropriate phase in the game, the American player will roll on this chart here, the continental levy chart. He'll roll a die. In this case, it's a 6. And you read the chart and it says 2 continentals in Georgia. Well, that's simple enough. You just put on 2 continentals in Georgia. Now, let's say he'd rolled a 5. That would have been 2 continentals in South Carolina. So on. So the American didn't know exactly what forces he was going to get, which was kind of realistic, and he couldn't do a heck of a lot of pre-planning. The other thing was winter attrition, which was very severe in this game, as it should be. In 1777, 2/3 of the American army would be destroyed. 1778, half. 1779, half, and so on. And by towards the end of the war, it got a little bit less, 1/3, and there was die rolls to roll for the odd fraction. So winter attrition certainly played an important part in this game. Okay, I might have misspoke a bit before when I said that the game is not biased. It actually kind of is American biased, and the designer has given a bunch of optional rules to balance out the game if you want. I had never played with them. For example, there's an option for increased British mercenaries, no British mercenaries, Prussia attacking Hanover, increased British effort in North America, stronger American central government. These were all optional rules that I actually never played with. I thought the original game was just fine. But after a while, like I said, we played this game to death, and we got to know the American strategies pretty well, and we began to see a lot more American victories than British victories. But in the end, I kind of liked it because it also made for a very, very good solitaire game. Because the American strategies are I don't want to say limited, but are kind of common sense. You react to what the British is doing. You don't have to win the revolution, you just have to not lose it. And in that sense, it's a very, very good solitaire game, though it was never advertised as such. So it's going to be in my permanent collection. I love the game. I think it's real great. What's missing from it? Well, there's no leaders in it. Remember, this is the Revolution painted with a very broad brush. So you're not going to get even a Washington counter, or a Burgoyne, or Carleton. There's none of the personalities in this. This is almost the war as if seen from England or from the Congress. But it's a very good game. I don't think it's out of date. I think it should be reprinted. Maybe give us some new fancy graphics, some nicer counters, but I don't think that's going to happen. Because we've got other Revolution games out there, like Washington's War, and I think they're thinking of redoing End of Empire and stuff. Anyway, that's my review of American Revolution, produced by Jim Dunnigan in 1972. A very good game. Thank you for watching.